Welcome back to Third Eye Weekly, brought to you by AT&T, only on BTRtoday.com. I'm your host, Zach.
I'm your host, Lisa.
Be sure to check out our new app, which is available in the iTunes store right now for Apple products. Android will be available soon. It's really great. Everything's streamlined. You can find all of our articles super easy under the Read, Watch, and Listen tabs, where you can listen to our podcast. You can watch this video.
Yes. And
it's great.
Stay tuned for our Android version coming soon.
Yes. And it's Revolution Week here at BTR. We're going to be talking about all things revolutionary. We've got a couple really good guests on the show this week. One of them is tackling a very large court case right now that's been all over the news, including the New York Times.
Yes, we're speaking with Nathaniel Rich, who is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, who covers the DuPont Chemical Company lawsuit that's been ongoing for decades now. Mm-hmm. And it's actually really surprising that nobody's really covered it as extensively as Rich has right now. And we're looking at a chemical called PFOA that was released into the waterways in West Virginia. And this is a pollutant, a carcinogenic, that's contaminating more than 70,000 people and largely contaminating other cities as well. So this is a really interesting discussion that evolved from how we can maybe revolutionize EPA's involvement in all of this. So the EPA right now wasn't even able to really test the chemical harms that were done unless there was actual physical evidence that there was harm that had occurred.
Right.
So this is under one of the acts, this chemical act under the EPA, which has only allowed the EPA to restrict about 5 chemicals since it was since like 1976.
Which was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah.
But since it's restricted the ability to actually test these chemicals until there is physical damage.
Yes, exactly. So there's only 5 chemicals that are restricted over thousands that keep coming into the market due to these chemical plants.
Right.
So what's really interesting is, what can EPA's role in all of this? How can that evolve? How can that be revolutionized in the future?
Right.
And my thoughts is that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is really, it's an important agency for sure, and it needs to stay. It just needs some fine tuning in order for not as much camaraderie with the actual chemical plants so that they can accurately test some of these chemicals that are coming out from the plants and the companies. As well as, I think, perhaps this law that doesn't allow for them to test these chemicals until there's actual physical harm, that should probably be amended or changed for sure.
Probably for sure.
Probably, yeah. Yes, for definitely.
I mean, I take a little bit more of a revolutionary stance on this, if you will. I think we should just get rid of the EPA completely altogether, because when you look at it, I mean, like you said, they can't test anything until there's physical evidence of harm. So that means these chemical plants and companies are the ones who are responsible for testing these chemicals. Yeah. And we don't know whether or not they're harmful or not to us until we actually start to see the effects of decades-long contamination. I mean, we're talking about entire towns, cities, families, animals that are being born with mutations and genetic alterations. That's something you can't reverse. I mean, that's devastating. And I mean, the EPA is completely in bed with these chemical companies. Nothing is going to change unless, I think, we completely eradicate the EPA and we replace it with something that has way more power to actually go in, test these things. Who cares what the chemical companies have to say about it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the EPA is a version of the EPA still needs to exist, but yeah, there needs to be a severance on their partnership with these chemical plants, because really, it's kind of the chemical plant telling the public, oh no, these chemicals are fine.
Right.
They're tested, but who's really checking the checks and balances of what these chemical plants are saying?
Right.
So you need the EPA just a separate entity, and made sure that it's a separate entity from these chemical plants to check the real harm of this.
Right, because even though there's this huge controversy around PFOA, and the writer of this article that we talked with for our interview has made it well publicized by now, I mean, the chemical that replaced it is probably equally as damaging as we found out during the interview, and we don't know anything about it.
And the EPA can't check it because there's no real harm
exactly.
that's being associated with
So
it.
essentially we're caught in this cycle. We're back to square one all over again, and all this progress that we seem to have made by muckraking this story and this exposure with journalism is really just perpetuating another cycle that's going to need to be investigated. And until we go back to the base and we just eradicate what we have now and replace it with something more viable, I think we're going to see these stories again and again and again.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating issue that definitely needs some work going forward. So be sure to tune in and listen to the entire interview talking about this very extensive piece that looks into the DuPont Chemical Company lawsuit.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning into Third Eye Weekly, brought to you by AT&T. I'm your host, Zach.
I'm your host, Lisa.